In this video and the next one, we're going to dive into yet another important piece of the Node.js architecture, which is events and the event-driven architecture. So most of Node's core modules, like the ones we already used, like HTTP, file system, and timers, are built around an event-driven architecture. And we can of course also use this architecture to our advantage in our own code. And the concept is actually quite simple. So in Node, there are certain objects called event emitters that emit named events as soon as something important happens in the app, like a request hitting a server, or a timer expiring, or a file finishing to read. These events can then be picked up by event listeners that we developers set up, which will fire off callback functions that are attached to each listener. Okay? So again, on one hand we have event emitters, and on the other hand, event listeners that will react to emitted events by calling callback functions. Simple, right? And probably the best way to understand this is to look at an example. And so let's briefly understand how Node uses the event-driven architecture to handle server requests in the HTTP module that we already used in another section. So when we want to create a server, we use the createServer method and save it to a server variable. This implementation here is a bit different from what we did before, but it works the exact same way. Anyway, this server_on method is how we actually create a listener, and in this case, for the request event. So let's say we have our server running and a new request is made. The server acts as an emitter and will automatically emit an event called request each time that a request hits the server. Simple, right? Then, since we already have a listener set up for this exact event, the callback function that we attached to this listener will automatically be called. And this kind of function we already know from before. It will simply send some data back to the client. Now, it works this way because, behind the scenes, the server is actually an instance of the Node.js event emitter class. So it inherits all this event emitting and listening logic from that event emitter class. And don't worry, we're going to use it all right in the next video so that you become familiar with all this logic. Now, just to finish this lecture, I believe it's important to mention that this event emitter logic is called the observer pattern in JavaScript programming in general, and it's quite a popular pattern with many use cases. So the idea is that there is an observer, in this case the event listener, which keeps waiting, keeps observing the subject that will eventually emit the event that the listener is waiting for. And the opposite of this pattern is simply functions calling other function, which is something that we're more used to actually, right? But the observer pattern has been designed to react rather than to call. And that is because there is a huge benefit of using this architecture, which is the fact that everything is more decoupled. We don't have, for example, functions from the file system module calling functions from the HTTP module, because that would be a huge mess. Instead, these modules are nicely decoupled and self-contained, each emitting events that other functions, even if they come from other modules, can respond to. Also, using an event-driven architecture makes it way more straightforward to react multiple times to the same event. All we have to do is to set up multiple listeners, right? Okay, and that is Node's event-driven architecture in a nutshell. And don't worry if this seems a bit too theoretical, you will see this logic being used in many situations throughout the course, starting right in the next video.